got Gators Breakdown here. We know we're business.
Gators Breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. Find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. Joining me after all the holiday festivities back again on this Monday night. Co-host Will Miles at Will Miles. SEC is where you can find him and read and reaction. Well, like I said, first time we've gotten together since the holidays. The Gators played a bowl game. They got the big commitment of Dallas Wilson. Of course, no need to really rehash all that stuff, but it has been, living up to the moniker, never a dull moment. Of course, that's just what we deal with here as Gator fans, but mostly good news there as we took a holiday break there. Gators getting a bowl win and the big recruitment commitment of Dallas Wilson, and hope you had a good one and Happy New Year.
Yeah, man, you too. I got a 5-star commit for Christmas. I got Billy Napier not falling face first in a bowl game for Christmas. Wasn't able to go, unfortunately. There were some extenuating circumstances with that one, but next year we'll see if we can bookend a couple of games for Max and I to go down and look, he still thinks he's the good luck charm because Florida hasn't lost since he went down there. So he went down for LSU. So you're welcome, Gator Nation. It's Max who's in charge, and hopefully everybody had a good holiday. Probably need to work off a few pounds just like me, and many of you might be doing it while you're listening to us right now. So so we'll try to keep you in a good mood and a good cadence while you're out there on the treadmill.
Hey, I hope you do. If you are listening to us while you're working out, thank you. I can't listen to podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I don't listen to podcasts when I work out. I need not everybody knows I'm a metalhead anyway. So, but I'm listening to my metal music while I'm working out. I can't listen to podcasts while I work out.
Well, I mean, you should just listen to my dulcet tones. Re-listen, Dave. Gators Breakdown. Make sure that everything has gone smoothly while we've been on here.
Yeah, now
I know why you can't listen to podcasts.
Here's the thing, I haven't really discussed it all too much. We'll get into Gator stuff here in just a second, but I guess we'll get a little personal here. Listening to podcasts, I really listen to more just general college football, not even other Gator podcasts, and that's not a shot at any other Gator podcasts out there. It's just covering Florida. I miss so much of other teams. So it's my chance to catch up. It's my chance to get back into, the world of college football, because ever since I started Gators Breakdown, I don't get especially for home games, go down there, tailgate, go to the game, cover the game and all that fashion. And now with the playoff in hand and getting to cover those 12 teams, it was this college football playoff. I find myself, most of my podcast listening is general college football.
Well, I mean, hey, so in your world, Georgia's like 1-1. Because you saw him beat Florida, and then you saw him lose in the playoffs. So your perception of where things are may be a little bit different than others. But no, I mean, I feel you on that, right? It's one of those things where this is fun. We enjoy doing it, but it certainly has some sacrifices when it comes to what we might have used to do on Saturdays. And it is, I will say, the playoff in many ways has sort of replaced that a little bit. My biggest criticism of the playoff has been that it has significantly decreased the urgency during the regular season.
Here.
But that does mean that it's increased the urgency now. And since the Gators aren't in the playoff, we can watch them all. And obviously when the Gators do get in the playoff, hopefully in 2025, as we're going to be talking about, we'll be able to watch all of those with much more interest as well. So, not my favorite expansion that college football has ever done, but we'll get used to it, and the champion will be crowned in a couple of weeks, and then we can get to the off season and what that means for everybody.
Absolutely, yeah. Plenty to get into offseason coming up as well, at post-college football playoff. But we'll kind of get it started here with this episode of Gators Breakdown, New Year episode of Gators Breakdown. And, I threw out a tweet the other day, Will, and Lord, I just didn't know it would really blow up like it did. Glad it did, don't get me wrong. But I guess when you include Georgia fans, Bama fans, and FSU and Miami and just kind of laying out what happened this past season. I guess I should have known while everybody's at home, not having busy schedules, that it would blow up like it did. But hey, look, it was probably a conversation we were going to have anyway for this Florida team and all that's happened. But hey, the theme of it is it's time. whether you think it will happen or not, it is time for it to happen for Florida, for Billy Napier, for this team, for this roster, for this staff. Time to take that next step. So that'll be the theme right here on this episode of Gators Breakdown. Before we get there, everybody hit that like button. If you're joining us live, if you're watching the replay on YouTube, hit that like button. Subscribe also on your favorite platform, whether it be YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, and leave some of those comments as well. And of course, if you want even more Gators Breakdown content, you can also join the conversation and discuss the Gators with fellow fans. Get access to the Gators Breakdown Plus Discord. You get exclusive access there through Gators Breakdown Plus to the Discord chat room, where you can engage in real-time discussions about topics like this and more with our community of passionate Gator fans. It can be pure football. It can be the recruiting side of it. There's a basketball room, baseball room, all that good stuff right there. Video games, movies, and TVs, if you want to get off topic too, as well. A lot of people certainly take advantage of that. But if you want to talk some Gators, one of the best places to do it out there, Gators Breakdown Plus Discord, access to that. Ad-free episodes as well. Gators Breakdown Plus member. Get that access. Link is in the description. So let's get to it plainly. As I said, it's just Florida. For Florida, and this kind of goes along with the tweet that I made the other day, it's time to take advantage. Georgia, Alabama look as gettable as they have looked in quite some time. FSU coming off one of their worst seasons ever. Miami failed to live up to expectations after beating Florida and didn't even get to enjoy a gigantic Pop-Tart. So include Texas, who you play next season. All those teams I just mentioned, new quarterbacks next season. Make of that what you will, but there is a change there. While you have your chosen one in DJ Lagway coming back for his first full season, take advantage. This is the window to win, and also to me will have it catapult the program. Winning in this window should continue an upward trend in recruiting, and get this in a more consistent spot for the Gators. Once again, I'm not saying it will happen. We got time to talk about all that for the next 9 months, but this is the time for it to happen. And I know this saying goes, and it gets thrown out way too much, but basically, if it doesn't happen now, then when will it ever happen? I think that does hold a lot of weight here for this staff, for particularly for this staff and Billy Napier, for all the questions about this staff and the roster. And if you make moves or not, either way, it's time. There's no better window given the late season surge, where your opponents are, where that conference is, having a ton of questions. Basically, all I'm saying here is do the things necessary to take advantage of this window and take the next step.
Yeah, I mean, look, Florida is a team that has been building for DJ Lagway the entire time that Billy Napier's been in charge. I would love to say that he's got an immense amount of talent, and even if Lagway turns out to be just about as good as we saw this year, that'll be good enough. I don't think that's true. I think Lagway is going to have to take a step forward. But I think what we saw is DJ Lagway was good not just for a true freshman. He was good for an SEC quarterback. And so there is a next step in there for him to take. And that's where all the hope comes from. But you mentioned the turnover when it comes to quarterbacks. Other than Lane Kiffin sort of, being a little bit weird about Jackson Dart leaving. Dart had a QB rating of 180.7 this year. Every other quarterback, or every other program in the SEC, if you look at their QB rating, the next highest QB rating in the SEC was Florida at 157.9, and Lagway was at 154.9. So Mertz and Lagway
repeat that, Will.
Yep. So Jackson Dart had the highest QB rating, 180.7. The next highest QB rating of any SEC program of any SEC program, right? So like I had Van Buren and Shapen at Mississippi State. I had Mertz and Lagway at Florida, and Reed and Wegman at Texas A&M. But the next highest QB rating was Florida at 157.9, and that's with Lagway playing on one leg. Now I don't have the I don't have the experiment there against Texas in the second half of Georgia added in. I took the two main quarterbacks, if there were quarterbacks there to split. But the point being that Lagway is representative of a QB rating well above average for the conference. The conference average QB rating was 145.2. Lagway was 154.9. My stat, yards above replacement, the average for a quarterback in the SEC was 0.4, so a little bit above average. Lagway was 1.65. So really, that's where the hope comes from. The hope comes from Florida has a quarterback who is kind of Jake Frommish. Like that's kind of now a different
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Different strengths, different weaknesses.
You're talking about level of impact.
In terms of overall stats, maybe even more like Jalen Milroe. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you think about like what he was able to do, hitting a bunch of long passes, but struggling underneath and struggling against drop coverage. Maybe a little bit more like Milroe, but the point being that it wasn't just Lagway's in there hitting some deep passes, and you go, "Oh, he was average, and he's gonna have to improve just to be like a Jake Fromm." It's like, no, he was already playing at a level of Jake Fromm. The question is, does he have that level that Stetson Bennett went to? Does he have the level that Kyle Trask went to? Does he have the level that Jackson Dart went to? Because if he can replicate what Dart did this past year, Florida's going to win a bunch of games. But that's where it starts, right? I mean, it obviously starts with DJ Lagway and then sort of radiates from there. We saw some improvements on defense this year. I still don't think Florida was great. I think there's a lot of work to be done there to make sure you get back to where you were, even at the end of the year. Florida on offense was 48th overall in yards per play, though, again, that really is sort of pulled back by the game against Georgia and the game against Texas. But they were also 48th in yards per play allowed. So this was sort of a middle-of-the-road team on both sides of the ball. If you look at teams that make the playoff, Ole Miss missed, even though they were second and fourth in yards per play on offense and defense. Texas, 24th on offense, second on defense. Tennessee, 55th on offense, seventh on defense. Alabama, 22nd on offense, 10th on defense. South Carolina, 69th and 13th. Georgia, 50th and 30th. So your point in terms of them sort of coming back to the pack, obviously losing Carson Beck. So my point is that when you think about the playoff contenders in the SEC, Florida has to take a giant step on one side or the other. But this isn't something like last year where you said in order to even think about sniffing the playoff, you're going to have to see a giant increase from both sides. Yeah. I don't, if they get approximately what they got on defense this year, when you take the whole year in totality, right? So obviously awful for the first 3 or 4 games of the year, and then much, much better by the end. You'd like to see that level out a little bit, but even if they get that exact same performance, if Lagway makes them a top 10 offense, they're going to compete for the playoff. But that requires Lagway improving to be able to do that. And likewise, if Lagway struggles a little bit, they're sitting in that 20 to 25th in offense, but the defense can take a step up into that 20 to 25 range. They'll at least be competing for a playoff. So really, I mean, there's no reason that this team shouldn't be competing for a playoff in 2025. The only reason is if you have an injury at the most important position on the field. But then again, I think we would all understand that, right?
Yeah.
Though I would say that Florida needs to do something to make sure that they've got that position backed up, because we can say all the things we want and all the platitudes about Lagway, and he deserves all that. At the same time, we're talking about a guy who had a non-contact hamstring injury, and you're one play away from having to have a backup step in and be able to sort of right the ship and give you an opportunity to win so that he has the opportunity to get back. And, if Florida had even been remotely competitive in that second half against Georgia, or in the game against remotely competitive at the quarterback position, or in that game against Texas, maybe we're looking at this season considerably differently than we did overall. But look, I mean, the game against Tennessee showed everybody that Florida could hang with good teams in the SEC. Game against Texas showed us that there's still a long way to go. But the games against LSU and Ole Miss, and the Ole Miss one in particular, showed that Florida was able to compete with a team that had an elite quarterback out there. And so, I mean, it's one of those things where Florida's won 4 games in a row. It's been a long time since Florida's won 4 games in a row. I mean, it's the longest win streak in the SEC at this point, right?
Yeah, longest win streak in the SEC at this point. And it's got to be, if I remember right, I know I said it, there's got to be 2020.
So, I mean, there's going to be plenty of opportunity for me to pick apart my own argument here, and I'm sure that I will do that over the course of the next 3 or 4 months. At the same time, as I look at what's coming back, as I look at what's important when it comes to the playoff, because now that you can lose 2 games and still get in, you don't have to have all your warts covered. I've had a lot of people on Twitter bring up, well, Michigan won last year, and now you've got these other teams in the playoff. Now, aside from the fact that Michigan was in a different conference, and aside from the fact that, SMU and Clemson were in a different conference, which does make a difference, there's no doubt that you get some hiccups at this point. You get opportunities that you didn't get before. I think in the long run, that's going to probably benefit the teams that recruit the best, but it also means there are some windows. And so, our friend Bill Sykes wrote an article on Read and Reaction a couple years ago about clustering recruiting classes, clustering talent. Well, the first part of that cluster is Lagway. Obviously, some of the guys they've got coming back with Caleb Banks on the defensive line. We'll see what happens with Tyreek Sapp. The linebackers and Pup Howard and Jaden Robinson that they're going to have coming back, along with Miles Graham and his development. Like, those sorts of things make you think, hey, maybe there is an opportunity to step forward here. But, Billy Napier has managed to step on a rake at every single point in his tenure at Florida other than the last 4 games. And so I'm still, I said this after the Utah game 2 years ago. I said it after the Miami game early this year. I need to see urgency week 1. Right off the bat. And I think, that's one of the things we're going to be talking about all year is how do you get going in week 1 as opposed to waiting until you get popped in the mouth to realize, oh, now it's time to get serious. And that probably is one of the big challenges.
Maybe it's because maybe it's a schedule Long Island U. That's what you do. Because that's granted, I know where you're going with that. Florida's first real opponent's week 3 when you go to LSU. So you gotta be ready, but you gotta be ready then. USF is week 2, and we know they've given Bama all kinds of trouble in the last couple of years. But going to your point, Florida's gotta be ready to go.
If you're playing for the national championship, you shouldn't be having any problems with USF. It's really sort of where it boils down to. And, I know Bama, like you said, Bama's had a little bit of trouble with them even when they've had an opportunity to play pretty deep in the season. But let's be honest, Alabama didn't win the national championship last year, or 2 years ago, even after they had issues with USF as well. You got to take care of that. I mean, one of the things I would say, Billy Napier got lucky when he was at Louisiana. He won a lot of one-score games. The game against Ole Miss was a one-score game. The game against LSU was much tighter than the final score indicates. Obviously, you lose the one-score game against Tennessee, but for the most part, the games this year weren't particularly close. Sometimes, though, that was on the bad side of the ledger. So even just giving yourself opportunities, like you look at Ole Miss this year, 3 one-score losses, they're really close to being in that playoff, even though they have some warts. I think that's kind of where we're going to be with Florida next year. Is there needs to be a recognition, or at least I think people need to recognize that there are going to be some warts. The good news is that we sort of know coming into the season, assuming that nothing changes with the format and they don't expand the playoff anymore, or I'm guessing they're going to change the automatic bids a little bit or something like that. But if nothing changes with the playoff, 2 losses gets you in. And then it's a question of, is top 12 and getting blasted in the first round good enough? But man, I'll take that argument right now, considering where we've been the last 3 years. So let's go for it, man.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up what you brought up, Will, because, that's probably where we should go next is why this can be seen as a time for Florida to strike and this be a window for Florida. And just looking at the Florida side of it and nothing else. We've brought up the outside of Florida, and we will go get into that a little bit more too. But just looking at Florida, you got Napier in his 4th season. He got that vote of confidence. You go on a winning streak. You got to build on that if you're Billy Napier. Of course, you mentioned Lagway returning as well. 4 or 5 offensive linemen returning. A stable of running backs you have a ton of confidence in. On the other side, as you mentioned, a defensive line returning key pieces in Caleb Banks and more than likely Tyreek Sapp when hopefully he announces soon. A linebacker room stacked with talent. And as you said as well, every team's going to have flaws. So for Florida, wide receiver, they have a lot to prove there. Does Florida have enough depth up front at defensive tackle and edge? And with the secondary overcome injuries and key departures? So look, there are still moves that can be made staff and roster-wise. We all know that. There is enough good to take another step, and can even be said if this thing is headed in the right direction, should happen. That step should happen if this thing is going where we want it to go. So one more time, it is time, and I won't predict right now, but if college football stays in the state it is in, and kind of go to your point, Will, in next season, if we take this season and repeat it next season, it's the volatility. There's no elite teams. We'll get into that and maybe why that's changing a bit too. But if next season looks a lot like this season, then Florida needs to take that next step and be in the conversation. And look, this is not a shot at Billy Napier, but any coach in his 4th season at Florida, I'd be putting the label of needing to compete for a championship on that coach. But for Napier in his 4th season, when you got that vote of confidence, the ending the 4-game win streak, then everything else I just laid out about the makeup of this team is there. It's time. I mean, there's no excuse.
Well, there's going to be some excuses because, that's the nature of it if Florida doesn't come through. I think, I wrote an article over at Read and Reaction where I talked about the lessons that we learned from the college football playoff selections. And one of the lessons I had in there was get up for your road games. And the reason is that Oregon had a close game at home against Boise State, at home against Ohio State, and then had a neutral site game against Penn State and on the road against Wisconsin. So the only scare Oregon had against a team that wasn't very good was on the road against Wisconsin. Alabama's 3 losses were on the road against Vanderbilt, on the road against Tennessee, on the road against Oklahoma. Georgia's 2 losses were on the road against Alabama, on the road against Ole Miss. Ole Miss lost on the road against Florida, on the road against LSU, somehow lost at home against Kentucky, which is why they got knocked out of the playoff overall. That Kentucky loss is the one that I think really stands out. And so then you start looking at the 2025 schedule, and you already mentioned the LIU Sharks. Ooh, that's going to be a tough one. And then South Florida. But then you go at LSU, at Miami, versus Texas, at Texas A&M. So at. You are on the road early on in the year. It can cascade pretty quickly. LSU is going to be in its 2nd year with Garrett Nussmeier. They're having the exact same conversation there, going, oh, if Nussmeier can just take a step forward. Now, You and I both smirk at that, especially me, because my moniker all year long has been pick against LSU because you can't trust a Nussmeier. But, look,
Hey,
LSU still.
SD Card 9 brings up the comment right there. The away schedule was brutal. It's a trap season for Florida. Don't be surprised by another 8-4 season, folks. 2026 is the year. I can't say that because if you got Banks and Sapp coming back and you got 4 to 5 offensive linemen, I'm sorry. I'm still looking at 2025 as a window year.
Well, so look, I mean, there's been 2 schools of thought with Billy Napier. One has been that he's building something here and you have to be patient. I have not subscribed to that theme, and I still have significant doubts about Napier as the head football coach. I am not one of those people who has apologized for calling for him to be fired because I thought his track record deserved it at the time. And honestly, 7-5 at the end of the year or 8-5 at the end of the year was kind of a miracle in terms of those sorts of things. And there were some close games in there. And I get it. I understand why he's there. I've come to grips with it and I will analyze it. I'm still hesitant to say this is where Florida needs to be. And then the other part of it is that, like you mentioned, the schedule ain't any easier this year. You got all those games on the road and on the road to start with. And LSU is going to be making the exact same case of 2nd year Garrett Nussmeier. The defense is going to be better. Brian Kelly's finally got his system in place. Year 4, time for us to take the step forward. Miami is going to have the exact same story, right? Well, we had Cam Ward last year, but now we're more of a team, and whoever they bring in as a quarterback there to sort of stop that, to fill that gap. Maybe Van Dyke will come back. Then you got Texas, who's going to have Arch Manning, who I actually think is better than Quinn Ewers, and I think Texas is going to be more difficult to beat next year. And then you got Texas A&M in the 2nd year of Elko. You're going to have Reed in there as a full-time starter, being able to play in that offense. And look, we always see teams the first year a coach comes in, they have inconsistencies. We certainly saw that with Texas A&M this year, but they're going to start to take on his image. You've always got the Georgia game. Carson Beck wasn't very good this year, so I actually don't think it's that big a deal that he declared for the NFL draft. You're at Kentucky and at Ole Miss. Kentucky is certainly one that Florida would expect to handle. But Ole Miss, look, there's a lot of guys, in fact, guys that Florida wanted if Austin Simmons ends up being the starter there for Ole Miss. And Lane Kiffin really always gets something out of his quarterback. So you figure that offense could be pretty good. Then you got Tennessee at home, and then Florida State at home. The Noles aren't going to be as bad as they were last year. And, they might still be bad, but they're not going to be that bad. I mean, they were so bad that DJ Lagway played terrible in that game, and Florida still was able to win it handily. The Tennessee team, is Nico going to be able to take a step forward because their defense was ferocious this year. And so their offense was sort of like if you look at all the peripheral stats for Nico versus Joe Milton last year, it's basically the same picture. It's the old thing from The Office, right? Look at this picture. That's the same picture.
They just got a really good version of Dylan Sampson, and he carries the offense.
But he's a redshirt freshman, and so what is he going to be able to do as a sophomore stepping into that role? Is he going to be able to take that next step? So, yes, Florida should be in the running of the teams that everybody looks at and says, "Can this guy take a step forward?" But if you look at Nico at Tennessee, I mean, he had a QB rating of 145.3, yards above replacement is 0.24. That's worse than Lagway. But he also played the entire year and took a beating and played in all of their games, as opposed to Lagway, who didn't start playing until halfway through the season. And so sample size starts to become an issue there. So I look through Florida's schedule and I go, yes, in order for Billy Napier to justify the faith that's been put in him by the administration, he needs to take a step forward this year. If it's another 8-4 season, it's time to find somebody else. We can go hire Ron Zook and go 8-4. With an elite 5-star quarterback. He's done it. And it turns out when you get the right guy to come in with that elite 5-star quarterback, all of a sudden you're winning national championships. So if you tell me that I got to wait till 2026 to see the fruition of this vision, I'm not sure I'm that patient. Now, we'll see what I'm saying at the end of 2025, given the way things look. And I we all tend to be over emotional week to week when it comes to these sorts of things. But I like, yes, Dave, I agree with you that this is where they need to take a step up. But every other team in the conference is saying the exact same thing. If only we get this, if only we get this. And that's actually why 2025 is probably the biggest opportunity for Florida.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Sapp, you mentioned Banks, the guys who are coming back, the guys on the offensive line also. And we talked about this right before the holiday. Typically over the past 5, 6, 7 years, we've had to project this guy is going to have to improve in order for Florida to get to where they need to be. There's only one place where I say that specifically for 2025, and that's safety. Like, there has to be improved safety play for the Florida Gators for them to get to where they want to be. I would like to see improved play at corner, but I think they could get away with what they got in 2024 and be okay. I think linebacker, I'd love to see improved play. I think they can get away with what they got away with in 2024. I think defensive line, obviously, especially the way they played towards the end of the year, if they play that way, Florida will be fine. Running back, again, Florida will be fine. Wide receiver, obviously some guys you need to replace, but you're sort of expecting Lagway to make whoever you put in there look good, kind of like Patrick Mahomes does for the Chiefs. We're like, they got some flotsam in there, but it doesn't matter because they got a quarterback back there.
A year ago, we were having that conversation that how are they going to win the Super Bowl with nobody at receiver? They haven't really found a way because you got Patrick Mahomes at quarterback.
So my point is that there's only one spot on the roster where you go, they need a definitive upgrade, but they can't have attrition where guys either decide to leave after the spring or where they get a bunch of injuries. They don't have the depth to be able to sustain that sort of thing. And then the other part is, and this will be interesting to see, you've obviously got Austin Armstrong transitioning to Houston, and then, what's going to happen with Ron Roberts? Does he stay on, take a bigger role? Do they bring in somebody else to help with what Austin Armstrong was doing? All that sort of stuff. There's not continuity on the defensive side of the ball, certainly at least not complete continuity. And so one of the questions I have is, what does that mean for the unit? Does that mean a net upgrade, or does that mean we're making excuses for the defense not having grasped the new scheme? I
don't care.
6 months from now.
I don't care. It is time. I don't care what move you make or what move you don't make.
So what you're telling me is that game in Jacksonville needs to go the orange and blues way. Otherwise,
I posted that already.
That
was my New Year's resolution. Florida's got to beat Georgia. I mean, look, we've given many excuses for the first 3 years. Some more than others. It's time. I mean, as you said, the word patience has been thrown around a lot. Year 4, there's a lot of patience.
So let me ask you, Dave.
Yep.
What, when you say it's time time for what?
Compete for the SEC and the college football playoff spot.
Compete. So if they end up with a season like Ole Miss, where they're right on the periphery of being in the playoff, but they don't actually make it, like,
that one's tough.
Would being a top 15 team have ever been good enough at Florida in the last 30 years?
I'll take it because I wouldn't want to restart with Lagway.
Making more excuses. telling you, dude. I think it's playoff or bust.
I wouldn't make an excuse for the season. I'm just saying I wouldn't know at that time if it'd be worth to blow it up.
Okay.
That would be, I wouldn't make an excuse for the season. I really wouldn't. But it would be like, to me, you'd be kissing 26 away.
Well, I mean, so I guess that's the other question. So flags fly forever. And one of the things that I'm sure I'm actually working on a piece for our preseason magazine that's going to be out here not that long from now. But I'm working on a piece talking about flags flying forever and what happened at Florida State, because I think that's relevant. And Florida State went all in at the transfer portal, went all in around Jordan Travis. Travis gets hurt. Obviously, they get left out of the 4-team playoff. Had there been a 12-team playoff, Florida State makes its way in last year and then gets demolished in the first round, right? But they would have made it to the playoff with Travis. And then this happens this year. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that Florida is in a position to fall off as far as Florida State did. Florida State had worse recruiting from the high school level over the years that Norvell's been there compared to Napier. Obviously, Norvell's been there a little bit longer as well. But he didn't have a guy clearly behind Travis to step in and be able to fill that role. So what does he do? He goes out and he tries to fill that with the transfer portal in order to make sure that things are looking okay. I think, to me, that's the thing I've got to see. If you're not making the playoff in 2025, you have to have a coherent quarterback plan beyond Lagway, because otherwise what happens is in 2026, Lagway goes to the NFL. And if you still haven't after 2026, Lagway goes to the NFL, and you're now back in you're sitting there going, oh crap, where do we get somebody, right? And nobody came to Florida State for a while as a quarterback where they could bring in somebody, groom them, have them ready to go, because why would you, right? You're going to play behind Jordan Travis. I think one of the things, you start talking about guys like Will Griffin and some of the other recruits who have come in, those are the guys who are critical to sustaining this, because, the contention that I've always made is that the Clemson model is difficult to reproduce. But that's essentially what Billy Napier's trying to do. And that was Taj Boyd to Deshaun Watson to Trevor Lawrence. It's got to be DJ Lagway to somebody if you want to build that way. And so,
that's why this is also a window to keep it going. Like, you have to win enough to keep it going. Keep the recruiting momentum up as well.
Well, I mean, okay. You're gonna make me do it.
No, I love the scenario you laid out for the Ole Miss, because at this, like, that is a threshold. Like, if you end up 9-3, it is progress in some ways, but it puts you on the cusp. I would think. Would it be worth blowing up if you're right outside of the playoff?
So I don't think anybody will.
It would be that. Yeah, I agree with you there. Nobody would. You're right. It would be tough to swallow to sit there and blow that up with a second year Vernell Brown III and a second year Dallas Wilson coming back with Lagway. I mean, at that point, I just don't think it would be worth to blow it up.
Well, so 9-3, top 20. Okay, good. That's what going after it now. Now's the time.
15, top 15, actually. If it isn't my Ole Miss, you're top 15.
Well, what about 8-4, man? And we have a couple of one-score losses. What about that? I mean, I'm just trying to.
I know you're right.
Because the playoff has clouded things in terms of what's acceptable. Yeah. Just like Mike White for years was able to skate by on getting into the NCAA tournament and then losing in the round of 64 and having a team that went 22-11 every single year. And you're just like, I see no progress. The recruiting isn't getting any better. The program is sort of what it is, and it's fine. Now, look, depending upon what happens with the investigations into Golden and all that sort of stuff, maybe that was an upgrade, maybe it's not. But I think on the court, you can't argue that guy has been a significant upgrade in terms of what's going on with Gator basketball. Now, the SEC overall has gotten better in the time since Golden has come in, but he's been able to maintain that. And I mean, they didn't play real well against Kentucky this weekend and still managed to hang in on that one. And that's sort of what I'm looking at when it comes to SEC for football. With the additions of Oklahoma and Texas, there's not going to be like you said something earlier that I do want to make sure people at least think about, which is a down year in the SEC is going to be really, really rare. Like, Oklahoma had terrible quarterback play this year. Last year, they had Dylan Gabriel, much better quarterback play. If they had decided to make the switch to the SEC a year earlier, we would have a much different opinion of Oklahoma and that program and those sorts of things. Missouri had terrible quarterback play this year and still managed to go 10-3. LSU kind of got average from Nussmeier. Like and I cited the stats earlier about QB ratings for different teams. But one of the reasons I was looking at that is that the quality of the quarterback play in the SEC was significantly down. Now, there's also a reason for that. I mean, one of the reasons for that is all the guys who win the NFL draft last year. I mean, you think about Jaden Daniels and Drake May and all the other guys. So all the other guys who wound up going in the NFL draft last year. The draft this year is going to just have a dearth of guys, right? I mean, the Patriots cared so little about it, they decided to not tank the last week of the season. So I think we're getting to a place now where things are equilibrating a little bit, the quarterback position. I think the transfer portal is probably evening things up a little bit. But I also think that at the end of the day, you're going to struggle to have programs like Ole Miss was up this year in a way they're not normally. I expect them to sink back to the pack. But I think LSU was down in a way they're not normally, and I expect them to rise. I think Tennessee, we'll see what they get out of Nico, but they have an opportunity to rise. I think you look at Georgia, Carson Beck was bad. 145.3 was his QB rating. He was negative on yards above replacement, my stat. So, I looked at him as basically an average quarterback there for Georgia. Can they get better than average play from somebody? Sure. And if they get better than average quarterback play, that's going to be a really dangerous team. So that's the thing I'm looking at when I'm saying, okay, well, how good is good enough? Because time to take advantage doesn't just mean it's time to be competitive with Georgia. It's time to be competitive with Miami. It's time to be competitive with Tennessee and competitive with LSU. Like 2-2 against the rivals this year is only acceptable because most years it's been 0-4.
No.
And so now,
Well, I do look at this as a 2-year window because I'm counting the Lagway years.
Okay, that's
it's got to be major progress this year. As I said, fighting for a college football playoff spot, fighting for the SEC, but you've got to make the playoffs one of these 2 years. You have
to make the Final Four.
Oh yeah. Okay, yeah.
No,
you're right. Yeah, you're right. I mean,
are we an elite program or are we Indiana?
Yeah.
Right, because Indiana just danced into the playoffs this year. Now, they had a good season. And look, I grew up in Indiana. My dad went to IU. My sister went to IU. They were having a great time watching them until they played Notre Dame the other day. And, look, it's a nice Cinderella story for that team to be there. But no one thinks that Indiana is one of the best 12 teams in the country. And certainly nobody thinks Indiana is one of the best 4. And so that fundamentally is the question that I think we get into here, Dave, is when we talk about it's time for Florida to take advantage. If you win the SEC championship, you're one of the best 4 teams in the country.
Yeah.
If you're Ole Miss on the outside, I mean, I still think there are numbers that suggest that Ole Miss was the best team in the conference, but it doesn't matter if you lose, if you don't get to the SEC championship game. And, South Carolina, I didn't think was a great team. I thought they were an okay team. But those are still teams. And Alabama, I mean, God, we saw all the stuff Herb Street went through when he said they should be in there. And then they laid an egg against Michigan. And so the question I ask is, if Florida ends up in that Alabama, South Carolina, Ole Miss milieu at the end of next year, is that indicative of progress? Or is it indicative of the program stalling out, even though it has a Maserati at the quarterback position, right? And that's my concern, is that if you're going 8-4 with DJ Lagway at quarterback, like as a sophomore, I expect him to take a step forward. And what that means is you've essentially got the Jaden Daniels 2023 season going on, right? Where, oh, look, Daniels threw for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns, and you lost 55-48 or something. I think they lost to Ole Miss that way 2 years ago, right? And if that's what's happening, then I think there's a little bit different feel. So I mean, in many ways, a lot of it's probably feel. I think
it is, yeah.
And I agree with you when you say it's a 2-year window from the standpoint of unless things just fall apart.
Oh, for sure. But my thing is, say it plays out this way. Florida's Ole Miss next year, but the next year goes and wins it all. Or in the final, well, if you make it to the Final Four and don't win it, that's going to be hugely disappointing. But, that's why I look at it as a 2-year window, as you said. Unless next year, and look, there's I've seen hot seat lists. Yeah, Billy Napier is still a warm seat. If you fail next year, you go 7-5 next year, 6-6 next year, bye-bye. That's not what we're looking for. But if you're Ole Miss next year and then you win it the following year, yeah, that's more than enough to I think make Gator Nation happy. But you wouldn't know that until 2026.
Yeah, it's interesting because the January 6th Bulls weren't enough to make Gator Nation happy when Dan Mullen was here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's essentially what's happening if you end up like Tennessee did this year, right?
Yeah.
Going on the road for a first round game against probably the best team in the country and getting absolutely pistol whipped is it's great for Tennessee fans that they were able to buy a bunch of tickets and were able to follow a map up to Columbus. But, it's like, again,
I don't know if I'd feel any better about it.
Well, this is where I think myself and the casual fan may end up having some significant disagreements over the next couple of years, because I think if you make the top 12, you might be further away from getting to a national championship than you think you are, right? And that being 11th or 12th is sort of what we should expect from a Florida team, because they're recruiting in the 11th and 12th kind of range in terms of talent, and they've got an elite quarterback there. So, look, I think I agree with you. It's time for Florida to take advantage. They need to take that next step. Lagway is a guy that we all think can take another step or maybe even 2 steps from where he's at, especially when it's the quick game and mid-range and against drop 8 coverage and those sorts of things. But there's more than just Lagway. There was more than Lagway in terms of why they won the last 4 games. And there's more than Lagway necessary for them to get to where we really want them to go.
Yep.
Which is, again, I mean, look, Taj Boyd got Clemson to, I think, 10-4. He was part of that game that they lost by like 70 points to West Virginia in the Orange Bowl. So it's not as though you're without hiccups. And Boyd was one of those, high-level recruits Dabo brings in, but then he transitions to Watson, and then he transitions to Lawrence. And he had that Kelly Bryant year in between where he had to make a choice, the same choice that Sarkisian's having to make right now, and might end up costing him a national championship. So, there's obviously a lot of nuance along the way. But one of the reasons I'm asking to sort of nail you down on what is taking advantage is I want to make sure we're clear about what we mean by taking advantage. I don't think Florida has the firepower to compete for national championships consistently without getting one in the next 2 years. Like, I think if you get one, the recruiting will pick up because you've done that. I'm not sure that Final 8 gets you some giant recruiting pickup. I'm not sure that Final 12 gets you some giant recruiting pickup. There's not enough data for it, but Final 4, is that going to get you a giant recruiting pickup? Final 2, maybe. And if we're getting the Final 2, obviously you're not making a change because you're getting to where you want to go. You just need to seal the deal. But the only way I'd call for a change is if they lose on a too many men on the field penalty on a field goal attempt. Then maybe I would. But so that's sort of where my head goes. Is the contention has always been Billy needs to win because that will bring the recruits. Now, I don't think that's historically proven out in some of the recruiting data, but I'm also hopefully humble enough to admit that I don't know, because the transfer portal has changed things a lot in terms of what those sorts of things might look like. That it is a new world in many ways, and with NIL and the payments and the revenue sharing that's going to be coming in and all that sort of stuff, Florida may have positioned itself to really take advantage of a deep run. And so that I think is really, when you say time to take advantage, or when I say time to take advantage, I'm really saying it's time for a deep run. Right. Sometime in 2025 or 2026, Florida has to be able to beat Georgia because it will be necessary to get to the Final 4.
Correct.
Florida has to be able to beat Alabama, has to be able to beat Texas, has to be able to beat Oklahoma, has to be able to beat LSU, and do it where it's not just a, hey, we beat LSU, it's a freaking miracle. And oh my God, we beat Ole Miss a week later. We never saw that coming. Like, where it's like, if you lose one of those games, like, I can remember the Ole Miss loss in 2008 and just being completely dejected when that happened. I can remember the Auburn loss in 2006, and Leak still didn't fumble that ball. Every time I look at that, he's still that was a forward pass. Tuck rule. Come on. So So that's the thing, is you're going to have to, I mean, there's two things you got to do. You got to make a deep run, and then you got to convert it into recruiting, recruiting significance afterwards. And hopefully Florida's positioned to be able to do that.
Yeah, you went through some of the the other teams earlier and kind of what's happening there. I think zooming outside of Florida, and part of the reason for this window we're looking at as well is the state of college football and the state of the college football playoff. Does it stay this way? Kind of going to your topic here that you were just discussing. Is this year an indication that at the top the elite are coming back down closer to the pack? All the 12 teams in the college football playoff had big time flaws. There was not your elite of elite that we've seen in recent, college football history. The top teams this year and whoever wins the national championship, to me, aren't the level of past champions of recent history. None of these teams are Bama, Georgia, Clemson, 2019 LSU, maybe even last year's Michigan. Will this year become the trend in the new age of college football? I think we can't forecast that, but I think a lot of people are projecting that to happen in some way. So if so, then this is definitely your window to strike and build around DJ Lagway. NIL and portal certainly has changed the sport, and I still fully believe the most consistent scenario is to recruit at the high school level as well as you can and keep that roster as much as you can. But what I think we're seeing at the top is the penalty of success, Will, in that department. While those schools continue to get the best players, those guys aren't sitting around waiting any longer. So their backups, their depth pieces are now on other teams and bolstering other rosters out there. And I do think that's lend itself to what we're seeing a little bit right now. And another side of that is, where's the best value? Do you continue to spend top money for high schoolers who may never pan out, or do you, or do you spend it for guys who have production at the college level and you know more of what they can be? I think it's a delicate balance, and I think coaches are still trying to figure out the best way to approach that learning curve right now, where there's this. It can cause some instability, I guess, is what I'm saying, of trying to figure out what is the best path to roster building. Also, spending so much on having to keep your own roster, so guys can go to the NFL, they can go to the portal, and if you still want to have them on your roster, that's going to cost. If you end up keeping them, it saves you from having to hit the portal, but it is certainly going to cost money and roster space if you need to make other changes. NIL and portal, to me, it's clearly closed the gap, at least for this year. We'll see how long it lasts. Those teams will, I still think, at the top, will likely still be consistent contenders, but it allows teams another way to close the gap. Maybe it's a one-year thing. Maybe the top teams didn't look consistent nor as good as they have in the past. Georgia, they had their 2-year window with Stetson Bennett. I think you look at how they built their roster. It's different right now, but they had their 2-year window. They had their quarterback to build around. I just think when you zoom out and look at college football playoff teams and the top of college football, there's just a lot of uncertainty right now, which I think lends itself to this window Florida needs to strike.
So it lends itself to a team or a program that's going to use the uncertainty to gain an edge.
Yeah.
And that's all well and good if you're a program that's proven that you're willing to do that. Now, here's what I'll say is I haven't had a chance to look at this extensively, but I was looking about, people were freaking out a little bit about the transfer portal and Florida struggling before they brought in Sturdivant and before Wilson flipped. But I basically looked at all the guys in the top 50 of the transfer portal last year at wide receiver. And what you saw was the PFF rating was the same the whole way down, whether you broke it up 1 through 10, 11 through 20, 21 through 30, 31 through 40, 41 through 50. And so when you start looking at rankings of the transfers, I'm finding that to be, I think they're relying on high school rankings a little bit when they're doing those evaluations because they don't have any new film. It's not like they're getting practice film from like Oregon when some guy decides to transfer. And so what do you do to evaluate him? Well, you go back and you look at what he was in high school. But we already know that by the time a guy can't get on the field, like if you're a 5-star commit and you can't make your way on the field, even in a big-time program, yeah, there's going to be the Arch Manning behind the Quinn Ewers type of situations every once in a while. But let's be honest. I'm saying put Manning in there because I don't think Ewers is good enough, but it may be that Manning's not good enough. I have no idea, and we'll see as we go. So I think that the point I was trying to make is that for programs that are looking for an edge, there's an opportunity to get an edge. But this reminds me a lot. It's funny, during vacation, I was sitting there. It was like midnight. I couldn't go to sleep, and all of a sudden on True TV, Moneyball comes on, and it starts going through the Oakland A's. And Billy Beane, early on in that one, was essentially the whole premise of that book is, we're not the Yankees. We have to build in a way that's different than the Yankees. And so Oakland was successful for a few years building in a way that wasn't the Yankees. But eventually the Yankees, and in particular the Red Sox, figured that out. And then you had big, deep-pocketed teams that hired the Theo Epsteins of the world and said, we're gonna take that edge that you showed us and we're gonna exploit it. So you think about Oregon having brought in Bo Nix for a couple of years and having brought in Dylan Gabriel for a couple of years. That's given them a real edge at the quarterback position. And if you told me that Georgia was going to have a deficit at the quarterback position to Oregon over the last 3 years, I would have said you're crazy, but they've been able to close that gap in the transfer portal. You look at a team like Alabama with Milroe, they haven't necessarily gone out in the transfer portal and brought somebody in. You look at Texas, they've had Ewers and Manning, haven't had to do it. You look at LSU, they bring in Jaden Daniels through the transfer portal.
Ewers in a way.
Okay. Sort of. I mean, hell, apparently someone's going to pay him $6 million to go someplace else next year.
I got your point. He developed there.
Yeah. So all of this to say that, look at Notre Dame, right? I mean, they've had guys in there the last 2 years with Hartman and then Riley Leonard this year at that position. And so teams are closing the gap at the quarterback position, which I do think lends itself to having a little bit more consistency. I would say, it's interesting. One of the things I've really been looking at recently, and I don't have a direct conclusion, but I have some guesses. And when I've started looking at the quarterback data in the SEC, I'm not seeing like the bad quarterback play that we've seen the past few years. So the good quarterback play is still there, though obviously Jaden Daniels was a level above everybody else. The good quarterback play is there. But what you're seeing is a much bigger middle class. And so I think that's where this again is my hypothesis, but I think that's where you're seeing the transfer portal play a role, is that before Alabama could go out, roll the ball out against Vanderbilt, and even if they played like garbage, it was still a 15-point win because they were playing against Vanderbilt. You bring in a guy like Pavia, and now you have to really show up. And it turns out the college kids don't always show up. And so an Ole Miss team that's better than everybody this year, I think they were better than everybody in the SEC, loses 3 games because those were the 3 games where Dart didn't play very well. Like if you look at when Dart struggled, I mean, he struggled again.
I remember watching that Kentucky game, and I was not impressed whatsoever.
No. Well, and in the game against Kentucky, he had a QB rating of, hold on, I got it written down. A QB rating of 160. It's not terrible. His yards above replacement was 1, but that still wasn't great. If you look at him against LSU, 117. And his yards above replacement was negative 0.9. If you look at him against Florida, 131 was his QB rating. His yards above replacement was 0.7. He got outplayed by Lagway there. So my point is that even the elite quarterbacks are going to have some variation in their play. And the guys in the middle range are going to have some variation in their play. And sometimes the guy in the middle range is going to have a good day when the guy in the high end has a bad day. And all of a sudden now you're in a dogfight. Whereas before, 3, 4, 5-year games during the season, your elite quarterback could have a bad day, and it didn't matter because the quarterback you were playing against was such garbage that that even if he had a quote-unquote good day, it wasn't good enough to compete. And I think that's what's happening in college football. I think it's actually the quarterback position is the equalizer, that what's happening is that when a guy like Jackson Dart has a bad game, when a guy like Carson Beck has a bad game, if you look at their loss this year, that was specifically
just Georgia's a perfect example of kind of I think this whole thing of where we're going of NIL and portal and all that kind of going slow start after slow start. They could, how many slow starts did Georgia have? They had it against Florida. All the turnovers that Carson Beck was having. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, their first half slow starts kept teams in games that Georgia used to just blow out. As you said, they would just be able to roll out with Stetson Bennett and go face a bad quarterback, and it didn't really matter. They were going to roll out there and win. But the moment that quarterback didn't start playing good, you knew he had a ceiling because we saw it last year. But when he didn't play good, you saw Georgia in a lot more dogfights than you had seen them in recent history.
Well, and here's the other place where I will put this to the test, or at least where I will put this out there, is why I'm having the hypothesis. Florida's safety position this year, where you bring in DJ Douglas, you bring in Asa Turner. We're all talking about Jordan Costello taking the next step forward. And the two best players in the defensive backfield at the end of the year were Triquez Bridges and Bryce Thornton.
Yeah.
And you're sitting there going, okay, I expected Jason Marshall to play well. I expected Devin Moore to play well. I expected Costello to take a step up. I expected Turner and Douglas to provide depth. And it turns out it's the third safety that you brought in the transfer portal who saves your butt. Yeah. Because Bridges was the best player on the defense for the entire, I think Tyreek Sapp was probably the best player the entire year on defense.
Yep.
But from a secondary perspective, there's no doubt Triquez Bridges was the best player in the secondary.
And you were getting some consistent play at nickel for the first time in forever.
Well, I mean, that helps too. I mean, it just helps there were not giant holes in defense. Just having a replacement actually made a big difference too. But my point is that the safety we thought that they were bringing in, who was going to be the big time addition, wasn't the guy. And so I do wonder whether a team like Georgia is going to go out there and kind of do what Lane Kiffin did a few years ago, where he just kept bringing, Simmons Simmons slips from Florida. He's got Walker Howard coming over from LSU. He had some other guy coming from Oregon State or
Oklahoma State. Yeah.
I can't remember even what his name was because he's never been to the field.
He was a starter at Oklahoma State, and then
it turned out he could have been a starter at Oklahoma State this year too. The way that was going.
God, what was his name? Go ahead.
But my point is that you just stack the guys. And if Dart turns out to be the best player, who cares?
Yeah.
Those guys don't play. They can transfer someplace else. But stacking those guys is, I think, going to be what happens at some of these elite programs. I think you're going to start seeing high potential guys.
Spencer Sanders.
There you go, Spencer Sanders. I think you're going to start seeing teams like Georgia, teams like Alabama, teams like A&M, and hopefully teams like Florida starting to stack guys in the portal. I think it's going to be a much more variable process to find elite guys through the portal. I think what you're going to need to do is sign multiple guys at a position. So Sturdivant is great. You need two more. I can't remember the name of the kid they just brought in the other day, the safety. Maddox, great. You need two more. That's just sort of the reality of the way this is, because your evaluations are great. That's all fine. But it's sort of the same thing with high school recruiting. You need the 5-star guy. He's got a 70% chance of turning out. But then you also need the guy ranked 150th, 400, and 700 if you really want to fill out that class. And if one of those guys hits, it becomes a really valuable thing for your organization. So,
but is there value in, and I talked about this on the last episode with bringing back a Caleb Brinks, bringing back a Tyreek Sapp, there's got to be some value there where, look, if you don't bring those guys back, you're hitting the portal for those spots. Florida doesn't have a lot of spots right now. So is it we look at this after the 2025 season and say Florida should have cut bait with some more guys to go get another edge player, to go get another safety, to go get another defensive tackle? Or is it what the move they made with, all right, we're bringing Barber back, we're bringing Slaughter back, we're gonna pay those guys a bunch of money to come back?
Well, they did cut bait with some guys. I mean, Jack Byburn's not here anymore, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, they did.
There are guys that they looked at and said, you were a productive member of this team, but your production is not worth the roster spot, the money that you're asking for, the playing time you're asking for, whatever it is. And I don't know what was going on with Pyburn specifically, but that's one of those guys where I look at and go, look, they had a productive player that they allowed to walk. Now the question is, who do you replace him with?
Yeah.
Right? Same thing. Jason Marshall was a productive player, at least for the first 5 or 6 weeks of the season until he was injured, who's now going to go to the NFL. How do you replace that guy? You've got all these seniors coming out, all the freshmen coming in. But it's not like Florida's had huge numbers over the past 3 or 4 years. In fact, that's been one of my criticisms of Napier is that when you only recruit 19 guys at the high school level and Georgia's bringing in 25 or 26, over the course of 3 or 4 years, that's another 17, 18 guys that Kirby's been able to evaluate and essentially process out, where you had an opportunity to miss or hit on guys more often. So, yeah, I mean, look, I think the Oakland-Boston baseball analogy is really where I sort of settle with all this stuff, is that there are going to be teams that find edges. I think Lane Kiffin found one last year because of the way early signing day and the transfer portal set. He decided he wasn't going to be able to compete money wise on early signing day. And so he said, I'm going to hit the transfer portal while everyone else is hoarding their money for early signing day and make sure I get the guys that I want. Now, this year it was reversed, right? The early signing day was before the transfer portal. Florida, certainly, I think, when you think about Wilson and you think about some of the other guys they brought in, I'm sure allocated significant resources to bringing in that class, all the flips that we saw right before the season or right before early signing day.
Yeah, I think the class ended up being bigger than the original plan.
And what does that do on the back end when you think about exactly what you're talking about? The money available through NIL and other things, but then also the roster spots. Do you have the roster spots available? So no, Florida should not have parted with Caleb Banks. They should not part with Tyreek Sapp if he wants to come back. Those were two linchpins on your defense and difference makers. I think the question that you have to ask yourself is, can you replace the guy who decides to go someplace else with somebody who has the potential to be a difference maker? And in many ways, stacking is one way to do that. The other way is you gotta get lucky, right? You bring in a guy like, I don't think Asa Turner's a bad player. Dude pulled a hamstring in like the first half of the game that he played. When you're a corner and you got a bad hamstring, it's hard to get on the field. It's hard to play that way. It takes a long time to get healthy. Those sorts of things can happen. Certainly, we would have been looking at a completely different season if Lagway hadn't been able to hobble around for those games against LSU and Ole Miss and some of the ones towards the end of the year as well. So there's no one way to build a program anymore.
Right. I think we are certainly figuring that out right now.
Which is kind of fun in some respects. It's also why Florida is interviewing general managers. Because it turns out
a whole front office, general manager. Yeah. I mean, look, the report of Jim Nagy being interviewed, the Senior Bowl guy. I mean, that's awesome to me. I mean, that is, and that's more personnel. His background's personnel. His background's not contracts. His background's not NIL. His background is scouting players for the Senior Bowl. But you got other front office guys. We know general manager and the money and the contract and NIL side of it. So
you can get a lawyer to do that negotiation. If you do it right, you can have a good lawyer who can negotiate those sorts of things and figure out all the terms and stuff like that. The personnel evaluation is the thing that's critical. So my criticism, and now that he's in the transfer portal again, I know people are having a good time with it, but my criticism of the Rashada signing was not actually that Florida couldn't come up with the money and had to let him out. The problem is that Florida had promised him so much money that I thought it was a good idea that they were able to back out of it, that it was a poor allocation of resources, right? That the 50th or 60th overall recruit is not worth $14 million or $13 million or however many dollars it was. And I think we all look at it and go, I'm pretty sure DJ Lagway didn't get that much, and he might have been worth it, but everybody no. So the personnel part of it, where Nagy or whoever steps into that role can say, this guy should be like, we have a cap, irrespective of whether other people have a cap too. We have constraints, right? We have a certain limited amount of funds, and here's how we're going to allocate it. And so you can sit there and go, okay, we can't get the number one defensive end because that guy is going to ask for more than what we've slotted for it, because we think it's more important to have a high-level offensive lineman, or we think it's more important to have a high-level running back or a high-level quarterback or whatever it is. And I think there's logic that goes into those decisions. I think obviously Lagway is proving that the quarterback is probably worth breaking your cap and finding extra money somewhere if you have the ability to do it. But you think about it, the NFL, defensive ends get paid, left tackles get paid, quarterbacks get paid, and then kind of corners.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But there's a big drop-off between quarterback, offensive tackle, defensive end, then a drop to corners and safeties, and then a significant drop to everybody else. So this is the interesting thing for me, or maybe one of the things that we'll have to get used to is, look, Trevor Etienne leaves, goes to Georgia. I know, again, people are having fun with the fumble and all the other stuff that goes on with that. But I think the lesson to be learned there is the same lesson that the NFL learned a decade ago, which is that running backs are incredibly fungible and replaceable.
Well,
and
right.
so
if Florida wanted to keep Etienne, but you make the smart decision of, we can replace you. We'd love to have you. We'd love to have you. But if you got to go, you got to go.
Well, and this is the personnel question, right? Which is, we have constrained resources. How many resources can we allocate to the running back room? And so the same question will be asked about Jadan Baugh at some point. And if you ask me Caleb Banks and Tyreek Sapp versus Jadan Baugh, I'm going to tell you that Sapp and Banks are more important than Baugh in terms of funds. So if you can only have one versus the other, and honestly, this is probably, and again, no inside information here for me, but this is probably what happened to Pyburn, right? Is that, you look at it, you go, Banks, Sapp, Pyburn will cost X. We don't have X for those positions. Pyburn is the one that we would part with if we had to part with one of the three. And so hopefully that means Sapp's coming back. Because
and look at it also as Pyburn, Searcy, Gums. You're 3 deep at that position. I mean, are you really going to pay all 3 guys if they all 3 want the same money, if 2 of them want raises and Gums stays? I mean, Gums can sit there and say, hey, I need some more too. So I think 3 guys.
I think the point is that it used to be that the coach said, I want that guy, give him a charger. And all of a sudden, at least according to the comedian there, Shane Gillis, who's given Saban some crap on game day a couple of weeks ago, you just load up the guys with chargers and everything's fine. This has now become an economics problem. This has become economics, arbitrage. It's become the type of stuff that people train their entire lives to be able to manage and optimize and get right. And so Florida, we'll talk, I'm sure I already saw a couple of comments in the comments section about offensive coordinators. I'm on board with you guys. I want to see that as well. However, if you told me that Florida was going to have front office personnel to help with the economic questions, I would put that significantly above having an offensive coordinator. Again, until we can't manage the clock at the end of the half in a game that costs us at the end of next year. So, got to do it all, though. I mean, it turns out that you still need to be able to prove it on the field.
Well, here I thought this topic would not take us an hour. But, hey, honestly, I think this might be one of our best episodes.
I mean, you've met me.
Not even that. It's just, I know you can go. I mean, that is no worry of mine. If I need to fill an hour, we can fill an hour. I really did not think we would fill an hour just on this one topic.
It's fascinating, man.
We had 2 topics planned. We're going to go back and look at your favorite Gators of 2024. I will save that now, thankfully. We got another episode down the road with this. But yeah, it is a fascinating conversation. I mean, because we're all excited coming off of the 2024. The 4 straight wins to end the season, big wins over LSU and Ole Miss. Got your quarterback, and look, that's kind of just where it goes to this. We've said it, we can't say it anymore. When you got a quarterback, you got a chance. Florida has their quarterback, and now it's just time to go all in. All the resources, everything that you need to do to build around this window of DJ Lagway. Is that too much pressure for one guy, for one quarterback? Hey, that's why you came here. If you want that statue outside that stadium like we all do, sorry. I mean, that's just what we're going to place on you. But look, he knows that. Billy Napier knows it. I just think the way this season ended with I think the world of college football and the way it looks right now, to me, it's time to strike.
On 3 had Florida in the top 10, and it's way too early. Number 9. So it ain't just us blowing smoke up their skirt. It's like that. There is an expectation that hasn't been around Gainesville in 5 years. Probably 2021 is when we looked at 2020. So 2020 was weird because nobody knew what was going on. Yeah. And I'm not sure everybody knew what was going to happen with Trask. And certainly the 10 SEC games we sort of looked at, and we're now the win over Georgia kind of changed our framework of our expectations.
You're right. We still didn't know about that team until they went to Jacksonville and beat Georgia. Then you're like, didn't you right? Then you change because you had that loss versus A&M. And you're like, well, shucks. Well, maybe we won't get it done. But you go to Jacksonville, beat Georgia. Okay.
Well, even then, we were excited about Trask, but it was clear. So, again, if I go back and look at his stats in the 19 season coming in for Felipe Franks, he played pretty well, but he was not the best quarterback in the SEC. And he wasn't even close to being the best quarterback in the SEC in 2019. He was just competent, and we were like, ooh, it's nice to see someone who's competent and can convert a third down. And I'd have to go back and look at those stats specifically, but I remember
you had Burrow at 19, so I mean,
yeah. but I remember there being limitations to his game in 19. This is different. I'm looking at somebody who has limitations in his game and was almost elite, almost. Like, came up a little bit short of that, especially when you factor in the last 2 games of the season. Like, if he'd have lit up Florida State and Tulane, I'm not sure I'd be able to maintain my enthusiasm. It was actually a little bit disconcerting to see the guy struggle a little bit, especially a couple of those interceptions. I know the Florida Gator, the FGPC, the podcast that does all the film breakdowns. I don't think that's right. The Florida Gator Nation podcast.
Gator Nation, yeah, they're good. Those guys.
Yeah, those guys doing the film breakdowns had some sort of stat about like against drop 8 coverage, Lagway is looks like Aaron Rodgers this year for the Jets, and he's bad when there's been a lot of guys dropped in coverage. He's got to fix some of those things, but those are things that you should be able to fix, right? Those are footwork things. Those are understanding what the defense is trying to do. In some ways,
if guys are dropping 8 and you got 2 healthy legs, you can make them pay in that regard.
Well, that was what I was about to say. Is it's knowing what they're going to do and checking to a run, right, and giving Baugh the opportunity to rip an 8-yard run off, right. There are opportunities to take advantage of a defense that's going to do that over and over and over again that Florida in the last couple of games has not been able to do. The Lagway's an assassin. The minute you decide to play cover 3, or the minute you decide to play man, he's going to kill you. And you can see that in the PFF stats. You can see that in the stats where you're looking at throw distances and that sort of stuff. There's a lot to like about him coming back. And a step forward for Trask from 2019 to 2020 meant a guy who was going to be borderline elite. I know there are people who think he deserved the Heisman Trophy. I would argue that's not the case, that he wasn't quite to that level, but he was really good. Lagway has an opportunity to be a clear Heisman frontrunner if he takes a step forward. And whenever you've got a quarterback who's in that echelon, now you're looking at 2023 LSU is the floor. And that's just a hideously bad defense with Jaden Daniels in 2023, where LSU goes 10-3. If that defense is even quasi-competent, that team's waltzing into a 12-team playoff had it existed in 2023. And that's where Florida has the potential to be. Obviously, have to make it happen, have to win some of those one-score games that Florida struggled with some of the details. Have to get 11 guys on the field consistently, because again, against Tulane had some problems on the field goal units with that again. So, stop wasting timeouts when when you have big plays, all the little things that hopefully are going to get fixed as well over the course of the next season. But I mean, it all rests on Lagway. We've been saying that for years now, and it was great to see him take that first step this year and see what he can be. But he's going to have to turn into that guy. Like you said, I mean, we are talking statue, right? If Lagway is statue worthy, Florida can be awesome. If Lagway doesn't reach that level, I don't think Florida or Napier is going to reach it either. So it'll be fascinating to watch.
A lot of pressure.
Hey.
Yeah.
He needs to switch to number 15 while he's at it. Go ahead and ramp it up a little bit.
He's got too much marketing in that number 2. I think he's good there. He's good there.
I saw you got the hat, man.
Yeah, that was good stuff. They sent that my way. It was good stuff. I have to wear it one day. I mean, it's blacked out, so it's kind of hard to see, but it's cool design. Cool design.
I'm guessing he has the ability to pay some people for design work. So it's
yeah.
There will be some new swag that drops, I'm sure, over the next 6 months or so.
Yeah.
Got to hit the iron while it's hot, man.
Yeah, for sure. All right, good stuff. Well, anything coming up on the website, Reading Reaction?
Yeah, we'll have some stuff up there in the next couple of weeks. It's taking a little bit of a step back in terms of writing since the season's over. But and then, like I said, we got the preseason.
There you go. Yep.
We got our preseason magazine we're working on right now. Reaching out, trying to find advertisers for it, and should have that out well before Father's Day. So if you're looking for a gift for your dad, something for if he's anything like my dad, somebody who has absolutely everything and can buy it if he doesn't, this is the kind of gift where you show up and you go, hey, you want to talk to me about this. If
you want to advertise here on Gators Breakdown or Will's Preseason Magazine, just send it our way.
Hey, there you go. Reach out to Dave. Reach out to me. Let us know. We'll be happy to hook you up with the Gators Breakdown rates.
Oh, good stuff. So yeah, look, guys, it's January. Will's already putting the notice out there that doing great work on that preseason magazine that is getting rave reviews year after year. So I'm certainly looking forward to it. So not a small venture by any means.
Thank you, Dave. So yeah, 70 pages of Florida Gator exclusive preseason content. So we will try to keep the Lagway content below 30 pages. Like that's the goal, is to be able to have some features in there.
Good deal. So, all right, that would do it. Good stuff. Like I said, in the title right now is your favorite Gators of 2024. We will come back to that. That was a popular topic on Twitter, so I certainly want to throw that back in there. Plenty time for some content here. Certainly one we got to hit early on as we turn the page to the 2025 season, but we'll get back to it. I'm sure pretty soon. So, all right, there we go. That'll do it. Will Miles at Will Miles SEC on social media. Follow him at Read and Reaction as well. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. Find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thank you for joining us on this episode of Gators Breakdown.